So I guess a couple of things before I start. One is I'm thankful to all the keynotes this morning who really set, that the whole purpose of those talks was really to set up my talk, just to let you know. There's my joke then. So I'm going to be referring to lots of those keynotes that we talked to this morning because it really was a valuable context for the type of things we're going to be talking about, the type of the challenges that the environment sector face when we're thinking about nature conservation programs under climate change. And so the South Australian Department of Environment, in collaboration with the conservation sector in South Australia and some other organisations, non-government organisations, are starting to think about these issues through a new nature conservation strategy for South Australia, which is really starting to think about how we frame our conservation objectives, our nature conservation objectives, given the state of the world and how rapidly the world's changing. So you can see that reflected in my co-authors here, so Jodie from the department, but also Paul Ryan from the Australian Resilience Centre and Jill from the Conservation Council, and they're just a few of the collaborators we're working on this stuff with. So I guess to start off with, even before we decided that the world was changing really rapidly, there's been a bit of a debate in conservation circles about the role of history in how we frame our conservation objectives in Australia. In Australia, we're kind of lucky enough compared to some countries, say such as Europe, some places such as Europe, in that we think we've got an understanding of what natural looks like, what this thing called natural looks like. And so often our default position when we're setting conservation objectives is we want it to look like it used to, or we want it to look like that, which is kind of like what we think it was before Europeans came along. Now, there's some key assumptions in that model that kind of need to be tested in the first instance. And one is this first one at the top here, which is we're assuming in that model that when Europeans arrived, that Australia was a stable, natural place to be and relatively unimpacted by human activity, which is a complete falsification. It was completely false. It was a dynamic environment, radically dynamic environment, been changing for thousands of years and thousands of years under human impact. One of the other key assumptions is that we have an understanding of, even if we know what the past looked like and we understand how those systems operated, we don't really know how to put them back together again. And so the assumption that having our historic templates as our conservation outcome, even if it's a legitimate goal to head towards, isn't necessarily a very practical goal. So we need to be thinking much more clearly about our objectives from the context of what are the values and the functions and the ecological processes that we want to occur in these landscapes to provide the services, the benefits, both from nature conservation and from a broader range of benefits that we're thinking about. Now, that's not to say that history, our view of how the world worked in the past, isn't relevant. It's just that people like Ian Lunt and Eric Higgs and Richard Hobbs have been talking about for a while now. There's a whole range of ways that we can use our interpretation of how these systems worked in the past to help inform how we do things in the future. So, for example, if we're concerned about habitat for a particular threatened species, we can use historical information to understand what sorts of habitats that threatened species requires and what sorts of ecological processes are required in that system to inform our restoration activity or our conservation activity. We just need to be thinking differently, I think, about how that historical perspective is used to help set our objectives. And then, of course, there's the elephant in the room, which is that the world's changing really rapidly, and this is what Leslie and Carl and others were going on about this morning, that not only is climate changing really rapidly and the ecosystems that we're in Australia are changing in response to that, but the changes we're seeing in the climate are only one of a whole multitude of changes that are occurring in our social and economic and environmental systems globally. So these are some graphs that were produced by the Stockholm Resilience Centre, I think, and the evidence kind of for this thing called the Anthropocene, where we've got these sort of jackknife graphs across a whole range of social, economic and environmental features of the world, just really highlighting that in the last 60 years we've undergone this dramatic stepwise change in how the world works, basically. So the short story out of this is that our view of the past and our view of how the past operated is going to become less and less relevant with respect to what the future is going to look like. And so we need to think carefully about what role that historic context plays and how we set objectives. Which is fine, except that because we've been using that historic context to help set our objectives, it leads us to the question of how are we going to set objectives in the future. And so we've been playing with a few frameworks around how to set nature conservation objectives under climate change in South Australia. And going back to Leslie's point this morning, these are kind of this multitude of frameworks and science that's been developed over the last 10 or 20 years to help inform this conversation and help link the science to policymakers and to decision makers so they can make better informed decisions around nature conservation and other elements of climate adaptation into the future. So we've been playing with this framework here, for example, by Gilson and others, that was published a few years ago now, and it essentially uses two axes to describe the nature of the strategic decisions that you could be making for a particular system that you're interested in, whether it be a species or an ecosystem or a landscape. So the two axes are, one is about how sensitive the system that you're dealing with is to a change in temperature or a change in climate generally, even if it's not a particular projection. And then you've got this other one, which is how much adaptive capacity or resilience that system has to cope with any kind of change, whether it be climate change or something else. And so you can sort of start asking questions of where your thing sits in those two axes, and depending where it sits, you can start asking questions about, well, if it's a system that isn't very exposed to future climate, so it's pretty doesn't change much in response to a change in climate, and it's also in pretty good nick, so it's also got a lot of built-in resilience to be able to cope with any kind of change, then probably our most appropriate strategic management response is really just to keep an eye on it, that sort of passive adaptation response. Whereas if we go to the other extreme where we've got systems which are highly sensitive to climate change and also are already had all their resilience taken out of them, so highly fragmented, highly modified landscapes that haven't got much left and things are just hanging on, then we're really just thinking seriously about that kind of transformative activity where these systems are going to function in a very different way into the future than what they have in the past. And our role as managers and as a community and as policymakers is to ensure that that transformation occurs in a way, or is facilitated in such a way, that it's the least bad outcome for that system. The key to understanding all this stuff is that not all these things occur everywhere, and so understanding where they occur and where they don't is really important, because we don't necessarily want to be facilitating transformation to completely novel systems if it's not required. It's a risky move to be making because we don't really understand how that stuff works. So again, we've been playing with this stuff. We did some work with the Commonwealth Government a few years ago around how this looks across southeastern Australia, and we mapped some resilience metrics and some climate sensitivity metrics against these two axes, and you sort of came up with a map like this across all these different landscapes across southeastern Australia. And I guess the take-home message from this is it's really this sort of sheep wheat belt through the Mallee and into the western parts of New South Wales, which are those systems which have been highly fragmented, biodiversity is barely hanging on, and you're going to get these dramatic shifts in climate which are going to result in even more change. So we can start targeting some of that effort. But going back to Leslie's point this morning, all that knowledge and even the framing of that knowledge, while those frameworks are really important for helping us frame that information to help make better decisions, that stuff still isn't being used, or it's rarely being used to actually make decisions and actually make decisions that turn into action. And so we start asking questions about, well, why isn't science, as a scientist and as a scientist working in government, I start asking questions about why isn't this information simply being picked up and used to make better decisions? So through the Nature of SA, this nature conservation strategy we're working on in South Australia, we started thinking about, well, what is the context that scientific information sits in, and how does that sit with respect to things like what the community values, what are the aspirations from the community there today, and also what rule set, what informal and formal rule sets are we currently playing in. And if we can understand all of those different parts of that decision-making framework, and we understand where there is overlap, they're the places where we're most likely to see we're more likely to see effective translation of information, but information from a scientific perspective, but also information from a community values and a rules perspective, where that stuff is most likely to be translated into an actionable decision. So the kinds of things we're talking about are things like that kind of scientific information that we've got lots of and which has been used to greater or lesser extent to actually make better decisions. And I put a unicorn here because I use this as an example with my children, that knowledge is really important, because it doesn't matter how much my child wants a unicorn, she's not getting one because they don't exist. So the science is still really useful for helping us understand what's possible biophysically and what the likely consequences of a particular course of action are. but it needs to be taken in the context of some of these other things. So asking the community what they think about what their values are. Now that's a really complex question to answer, because we've got to be asked questions like, what do we mean by the community, and who has a stake in the set of decisions around nature conservation that we're making? Is it just the local community? Do we weight the local community's aspirations higher than the Australian community or even the global community? I often think of the example of the conservation of iconic species like tigers or panda or things like that we in Australia have a stake in. Most of us actually want tigers and pandas to persist into the future, and yet we're not the locals who are being most directly impacted by those conservation decisions on the ground. So how do you actually frame that complexity in community values when it is multi-scale? And the kinds of decisions, the kinds of rules that I'm talking about can be those informal rules, so the social norms that we all operate on a daily basis, even though we're not forced to necessarily by legal structures, but also those more formal rules, so state and national legislation, but also some of those international obligations that we are already signatories for and partly reflect some of those global community values that we aspire to, and also reflect the sort of moral and ethical underpinning of nature conservation that's been around for decades that we wouldn't necessarily pick up if we asked the local community about their values around things like the inherent right to persist as a species, or issues around intergenerational equity. So we can only ask the current generation what they think. We can't ask what those future generations want, but we have an ethical obligation to ensure that those future generations have the same or similar opportunities to what we have today. So there's where some of those rules-based things are. I guess the other point of this diagram is that these things aren't fixed. So we can do a few things with a framework like this. One is we can actually ask the question, when there's no overlap for a particular decision, what are the consequences of that? So who wears the risk around that? So if the knowledge or the rules say you can't do this thing because of these obligations, then there's potentially community impact on local communities around that, so they can wear some of that risk if those rules and values don't overlap. The other thing you can do is understand how these different sectors can change, how they can be influenced so that there is increased overlap, which makes that decision context bigger and allows you to make decisions much more easy. Now, I started off by talking about the intersect between the science generation and the science translation and the decisions. And I guess for this conference and this audience in particular, it's something I think about a lot, and this kind of framing helps me think about it in a smoother way, I guess. And so I guess going back to some of the things Leslie was saying this morning about the challenges of translating knowledge into actual information on the ground, and some of the things that Megan talked about understanding the framing of how decisions are actually made, and some of the things Megan was talking about refer to processes, formal and informal, which mean that the scientific information that goes into a process goes through a long-winded process in terms of where the decision's actually made, and that can often just be the formal bureaucratic processes, let alone the organisational issues, the cultural issues, the psychological issues that go through that process. So I think some of this framing that I've been talking about helps us understand the context within which that scientific information sits for scientists, so they can actually understand the relationship between information and decision making, and understand that is a messy space to play in. And we often think about the delivery of science into policy as we need to find better ways to communicate the science. We need to find better ways to synthesise and translate and communicate the science so that policymakers and decision makers can make better decisions or more informed decisions. And that's certainly a really important part of it, but I think where we've come to and where we've stepped a long way is having the scientific community have a much better understanding of how the decision-making world works and the decision-making in the context with which decision-making sits. And that is about those community aspirations, and it is about the existing and emerging rule sets that we work under. It is about the politics of the situation and the bureaucracy that we work in. So there's a complex space there, and I think we're increasingly, with regard to the engagement of government with the research sector, I think we're developing a culture which isn't just that delivering science in a communicable way that's easily digestible by policymakers, but having that two-way relationship between scientists and the policy world, so that there's as much an understanding from the researchers about what the decision-making context of working is, as there is an understanding from policymakers about what the scientific context is. And I guess I'll finish, now that I can hear some music, with this quote from Mencken, who's an American journalist, and I thank Fiona Gill for sending this to me this morning. There's always a well-known solution to every human problem. It's neat, it's plausible, and it's probably wrong. And I guess the point of that is that let's all step up and say this is a really complex, wicked, messy space that we're working in, particularly with respect to climate adaptation. We don't know what the future holds. There's a lot of uncertainty around the future, and we didn't even know how the world worked in the past. But if we all step up together, the research sector, policymakers, decision makers and the community, and all acknowledge that it is a complex problem, and we all acknowledge that we all have a role to play in that in a collaborative space, then I think it's actually a really good opportunity to start tackling these problems in which the science, for example, is used in a much more effective way to actually make effective decisions that are meaningful on the ground. Thank you.